Okay, this is day 3 of the 1920s. We're going to get into some of the art today. So in the 1920s, this is kind of a precursor to the hippies. This is, kind of the free thinking, free living, nonconformist artist types, writers, painters, musicians. And after World War I, you're going to see a huge explosion of these creative people, and they're going to move to various areas where they can kind of be together. Greenwich Village in New York City, which is still a very big haven for artists. South Chicago, Newtown in Chicago. Taos, New Mexico. Again, the art's there, and some of these people are going to move all the way across the ocean to Paris. These guys that move out of the country are called expatriates. Basically, they're rejecting the racism, the materialism of America, and they are moving to Paris, but they are retaining their citizenship. And these folks are going to be known as the Lost Generation. Ernest Hemingway was one of these authors. Now he is going to come back. He's going to live in Key West. He is going to be a reporter during World War II, during the Spanish Civil War, and he is going to write a lot of short stories as well as several novels, including The Old Man and the Sea and A Farewell to Arms. He is a 7 novels, 6 short story collections, nonfiction. He was an ambulance driver in World War I, journalist throughout his life. He was a hunter and a fisherman, lived all over the world, and basically later in life, he gets cancer, and he is going to take his own life and go out, he said, go out like a man. This is Gertrude Stein, and Gertrude Stein was a very wealthy woman who left New England, and she is going to be the first openly gay writer. And she is the one, she has a big house in Paris, and all these writers and artists will come and stay with her. She gives them wine, they drink a lot, they smoke a lot, and she's the one who coined the expression, "We are a lost." She wrote plays, poetry. She was a painter. She kept a journal, and she is best known for coining that term, the lost generation. She writes a kind of almost a love story to her lover, Alice B. Toklas, and who she was in love with a married woman, and a lot of her poetry, some of her plays are kind of based on that relationship. This is William Faulkner, and William Faulkner is from Mississippi. So he is one of the very first Southern writers. He writes a couple of very famous novels, The Sound and the Fury and Absalom, and he writes about life in Mississippi. So he's a very, I don't know, I've read both books. If I was going to recommend one, probably The Sound and the Fury. But just when we do Quiz Bowl and we talk about authors from the South, William Faulkner is the one. We're going to have new kinds of poetry, so new innovations in poetry. And two of the guys that are best known for these new innovations are T.S. Eliot and E.E. Cummings. And you'll get an idea what I'm talking about. This is T.S. Eliot's The Burial of the Dead, and this is from a very long poem. This is just one of many verses. So I'm going to read it real carefully. April is the coolest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. Winter kept us warm, covering earth in forgetful snow, feeding a little life with dried tubers. So I'm gonna ask you a couple questions here. This is E.E. Cummings, and E.E. Cummings, notice the capitalization, hardly any punctuation. Here's his poem, Who knows if the moon's a balloon coming out of a keen city in the sky filled with pretty people? And if you and I should get into it, if they should take me and take you into their balloon, why then we'd go up higher with all the pretty people than houses and steeples and clouds. Go sailing away and away, sailing into a keen city which nobody's ever visited, where always it's spring and everyone's in love and flowers pick themselves. And he kind of writes about the decadence of the society of the rich in the 1920s. So know The Great Gatsby and F. Scott Fitzgerald. We have Chicago poet Carl Sandburg, and he used common speech to glorify the Midwest and the expansive nature of American life, just harsh language. He calls Chicago the hog butcher of the world. We have an American playwright, Eugene O'Neill, and he's searching for meaning in small town modern society. He looks at, what might look like what's good on the outside, the deep underlying stuff that's going on in modern. And now we come to the Harlem Renaissance. Harlem Renaissance, this is a period of wonderful literature and music and art from the African American community.
When the Dutch founded Harlem in 1658, it was a sleepy little town. But a century later, its rolling hills were dotted with the estates of wealthy farmers and merchants. Harlem was rural, and the population was mostly white. Things have changed a lot since then. Today, Harlem is a very diverse section of New York City. The neighborhood has a rich blend of different types of music, food, art, dance, and literature. But most of all, it's known as a place with a rich African-American heritage. And one period in history is responsible for giving us that impression: the Harlem Renaissance. The word Renaissance means rebirth. It usually refers to a period of energetic artistic and intellectual activity. The Harlem Renaissance celebrated the unique culture of African Americans. It began in 1919 and continued into the early 1940s. One cause of the Harlem Renaissance was a mass movement of African Americans from the South to the North. Many factors pulled people from the South. Higher wages, greater educational opportunities, and the hope of escaping racism were only a few. Jobs were another. World War I and immigration reform in the 1920s slowed the flow of immigrants from Europe. This opened up a huge number of jobs in the industrial North to African Americans, especially in New York City. But the roots of the Harlem Renaissance reach back even further. In 1904, the Lenox Avenue subway stop was completed. This made traveling to and from Harlem faster and easier. Soon after, the price of homes in the neighborhood dropped, and Harlem became an affordable place for African Americans to live. Many were able to buy homes for the first time. Harlem grew into a tight-knit community made up of African Americans from the South, Black immigrants from the West Indies, and native New Yorkers. The stage was set for a flood of Black artistic and literary works. The artists and writers of the Harlem Renaissance used different styles and subject matter, but their work shared common themes. Two themes were hope and pride. The Great Migration and the promise of opportunity in the North had given Black Americans more control over their lives than ever before, promoting a sense of pride and hope for the future.
So Harlem, it's basically a result, the Harlem Renaissance, of that great migration, and lots of, immigration from Jamaica and other areas in the West Indies, as well as New Yorkers. And this really was an amazing time. Remember, Renaissance. So from 1919 to 1935, which is right in the midst of the Depression, this was a very, very vibrant time. The population went from 30,000 to 300,000 by 1930 in Harlem. And these are some of the folks that that stayed there and created. One of the most important first writers was a guy named Claude McKay, and he was from Jamaica. And when he came to America, he had this vision of freedom, and read about the lynchings that were going on. If you remember Ida B. Wells talking about that, and the racism that was going on in the South with the Jim Crow laws. And he wrote letters and essays, and he was angry. And after a particularly bad thing that had happened, I believe it was in Louisiana, he writes to the white fiends, "Think you I am not fiend and savage too? Think you I could not arm me with a gun and shoot down 10 of you for every one of my black brothers murdered and burnt by you?" So he was reaching out, his frustration, his anger with what was going on in Langston Hughes is probably the most important writer from this period of time. He is the most prolific writer and probably the first to make a really good living from his. This is his most famous poem. "What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load. Or does it explode?" He wrote music, he wrote plays, he wrote stories. He wrote a plethora of poetry, just beautiful, beautiful poetry. Some of it very poignant, some of it angry, some of it funny. He amazing talent. Here's another poet, Cullen. He came from the South and had kind of a sense of humor when he wrote. This is one called "For a Lady." "She even thinks that up in heaven her class lies late and snores, while poor black cherubs rise at 7 to do celestial chores." Zora Neale Hurston, a black woman from the South, and she writes about life of strong black women in the South. Their Eyes Were Watching God is an amazing book. You have to kind of get used to the vernacular. She uses the language of the time and the people, but once you get into it, it's almost poetic. It's a beautiful book. Mules and Men, also a beautiful book. Both of them were Oprah book choices, and that's Zora Neale Hurston, one of the first black women novelists from the Harlem Renaissance. James is the author and composer of the Russian and
Lift every voice and sing till the heaven ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea.
Okay, a beautiful, beautiful song. Okay, so we also had some folks come to Harlem from Jamaica, and one of these immigrants was a guy named Marcus Garvey, and he's going to bring an idea of Negro nationalism. Basically, he is glorifying black culture and tradition. He's saying, hey, let's not straighten our hair, let's wear beautiful, beautiful clothing, and let us celebrate who we are in our culture. He's going to be the founder of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, and this is promoting black pride and unity. And he is saying we don't need to cater to the white people. He actually is going to start a movement that says, let us separate it. And the movement is called the Back to Africa movement. This is Marcus Garvey. And he starts this movement, and he actually has
Jazz was only one element of a great artistic movement happening in Harlem in the 1920s. The movement was called the Harlem Renaissance, and it encompassed not only music, but literature and politics as well. Jazz had become the most popular music of the time. But writers like Langston Hughes and Jean Toomer did much to introduce African-American culture and concerns to the world. Marcus Garvey became the most important political leader of the Harlem Renaissance with his Universal Negro Improvement Association. As the largest black organization in U.S. history, the UNIA stressed racial pride and self-rule. Marcus Garvey sought to create an independent black economy and planned to lead followers to the creation of the Empire of Africa, a new nation in Africa that would provide African Americans with the liberties they were denied in the United States.
He is the man who is credited with Black is Beautiful. And you can see him in this colorful uniform here. He creates, or he has a steamship line called the Black Star Line Steamship Corporation. And he actually sells tickets to people to return to Africa and to set up their own colony. Well, that wasn't so successful because people were kind of enjoying being in America and having the comforts of home. Although he'll sell a few tickets, he gets arrested for mail fraud, and he is going to be imprisoned. So this was his flyer, home in Africa, and he is soliciting people to go to Liberia, West Africa, and settle and create their own country, basically. And it is not a successful endeavor. However, he is going to be an inspiration to later civil rights leaders. His ideas led to this sense of pride and hope, and you're going to see the phrase "Black is Beautiful" used during the civil rights movement in the 1960s.